Okay, I'll start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you are joining us from. And then before I start, I apologize if I mumble a bit because here is 4 a.m. So my brain might not function well for today. So apology before. My name is Elsa Moon from Kingston University, London, and a bit of introduction of myself is I'm a moving image artist and a researcher of experimental film. And it is my pleasure to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I would like to take a bit of slow breathe together with all of you because we have two fantastic books to sit with over the next hour. This year, our conference invites us together under an open-ending heading, the yet to be known. I'd like to think about it for a moment through Deleuze and what is philosophy. Deleuze and Guattari characterize chaos by the infinite speed at which determinations take shape and vanish. As they write, chaos is not an inert or stationary state. It teems with every possible form, each one arising as another disappears, too quickly for any of them to hold. The problem of philosophy, they say, and I'd like to add, of practice and research too, is to acquire a consistency without losing the infinite into which thought plunges. And for them, art, philosophy, and science are the children of those chaos. The yet to be known for me carries resonances with that chaos. It seems to point forward, and yet it speaks just as much about the here and now, or even the past, present, and future here and there, fold into one another, much like this conference itself, where so many time zones overlap, merge, and echo across this single Zoom room. We cannot pin down precisely what it is, and at the same time, is anything but empty. It is full of possibility and movement, a living space of creativity that overflows. Within that space of creativity, our two books moves in different direction. The first takes a figure we believe we know, the vampire, centuries old and endlessly retold. And it shows that figure becoming something new the moment the player pick up its avatar and subjectivity. Here, the known turns unknown once again. The second takes the very ground we most want to trust, the real and its image. And it shows that ground slipping until we can no longer be sure of what we know of or how we know it. Both books then, for me, that dwell along the line between the known and the yet to be known. So let me describe how we will spend our hour together. We will begin with the authors, who will each give a short overview of the core ideas of their book. As we listen to these short presentations or overview of talk, I invite everyone to begin conceiving questions of your own or for our conversation later. After both talk and the presentation, I will hold a moderate conversation. The guideline asks us to talk about both the set content of the books and the writing and publishing journey behind them. So we will try to touch on both. After that, I will invite all of you into a group conversation and questions. And then as a contribute to Professor Patty Zimmerman, we will close by sharing our takeaways in the chat. A word or a brief phrase we want to carry out of this room with us. So I'm thrilled to introduce our authors. First, we will speak first with Matthew Thompson about his book, and then we will turn things over to David, Kathleen, and Mark for theirs. I will keep these bios very brief so that we can move into our conversation, and the full bios will be waiting for you in the chat. So Matthew Thompson is the author of Vampire in Interactive Media, Playing Dead, published by Edinburgh University Press. He worked for both Griffith University and currently the University of Southern Queensland. He completed his doctoral work at the Australian National University on the mythology of Jack the Ripper, and he writes across a broad range of subjects from Jekyll and Hyde to zombies to poison. in tabletop role-playing games. He now studies the ways interactive media reshapes the figures we thought we already knew. So I imagine many of you will find him a robust resource for your questions today. So Matthew, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with everybody. My book, Vampires and Interactive Media Playing Dead, is a sort of journey I began when I finished my doctoral thesis on Jack the Ripper. And during that thesis, I looked at a couple of board games and video games when I was evaluating how the Ripper was reconstructed during contemporary times. And it occurred to me during these analyses, that oftentimes interactive media is both sort of categorized in a way that I find particularly, in a way that's I find particularly doesn't quite allow itself to get to the depth of what it can offer, both as an art form and as an academic venture. And also, I think it is often fractured. So oftentimes we find that video games get sort of pushed towards film, and other sort of interactive forms of media, such as tabletop role-playing games and board games, sort of get either left behind or sort of get moved towards a different sort of space. And I wanted to sort of show how, while these different mediums have different emphases and different uh, ideas, different approaches, at their heart, they're all interactive media. And I wanted to find a way to sort of show how they can challenge our preconceptions of certain figures and certain Gothic milieu. And with the vampire, I think the vampire allows us to look at this with a way that sort of um, endears us towards the very basic tenets of the vampire. The vampire, by its very nature, is something that removes sustenance to support its own sustenance. And that is something that video games or board games or tabletop role-playing games can use as a mechanic very easily. It can use it as a way that interacts literally with the world. And the more I researched it, the more I found that the vampire was a figure that dwells in interactivity and the liminal space. Just as the vampire is between living and dead and goes between both worlds and cannot survive unless it has contact with both worlds, the video game avatar that the player incorporates is something that also in, interacts with the player's own player movements, but also with the environment of the virtual space. And in this way, I think there are really interesting parallels that can be done, not only to help video games create, games as a whole, deal with the active exposition, but also to create interesting new scenarios where the vampire can really come into its own and can create scenarios where vampires can be sort of extended beyond where they are in places like film and television. So I'd just like to briefly talk about both points in my remaining minutes. Exposition, for all interactive scholars would know, is sort of the enemy for ludic narrative. And the reason for that is, if you are explaining, you're not really allowing the player to participate. And one of the challenges with interactive media is to find ways to allow players to engage with a text without making them feel like they're being explained to, or making the world feel didactic. The vampire gets around this for a couple of reasons. The vampire has a raft of cultural knowledge that everybody can engage with. Everybody knows the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the vampire, but also the vampire is somebody that, by its very nature, by having a mortal life and having an unlife, so to speak, is somebody that can be incredibly customizable. It can be tailor-made to the game that you want to design. And so while you have your Draculas and your 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗓, you also have 20th century vampires in Vampire the Masquerade, possibly the second best-selling role-playing game of all time. And with that, you can create vampires that touch upon various subcultures, not just goth subculture, but also body piercing subculture, bikey subculture, and far many, many more. And you can create a variety of vampires that really allow you to touch upon and comment on these various subcultures and create something that is both other but speaks to the modern day. The other point about vampirism that I want to cover is the notion that uh, vampirism often creates a sense of purpose for the player because the mechanisms of vampirism are very easy to point and click towards players. And so the notion of vampirism as something that if people have that common knowledge, it's easy for them to create a mechanic that reflects this common knowledge and creates a sort of positioning of the vampire as something intriguing. And finally, we have seen in interactive text recently the notion of vampirism becoming challenged and even extended upon in the interactive space. One of the most interesting games in the solo tabletop role-playing game space recently is a game called 𝗪𝗖𝗓𝗓 Vampire, which is essentially a journaling game. What makes it particularly interesting is that as you go along through the game, you create a sense of, you create memories for yourself. And as you go on, as you get older, you literally have to cross these memories out of existence, obliterating your own memories as you age. And I think it's a really fascinating commentary on the notion of immortality and what immortality can take away from you, as well as what it can give to you. And I don't think I have ever seen a text do such an interesting approach to something like immortality as 𝗪𝗓𝗓 Vampire does. And I think it's because of that ability to engage with the player, to challenge the player, to ask questions and choices of themselves, that it continuously emphasizes the idea of vampirism through a new approach. And so I am very privileged to be here today to talk to you more about my book. And I hope that I'm able to answer some of your wonderful questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. What stays with me while I was reading your book is a vampire as a figure of liminality that you mentioned, something poised on a threshold. At once an enemy the player fights, and an avatar the player inhabits. With your subtitle, Playing Dead, is already playing on that undead in between state of the active verb, playing, and the state of dead. The player meets its rights on the border and is asked to cross over and play as it. So I want to hold on to that idea of threshold because our second book lives on a threshold of its own and the wavering line between the image and the real. So our second book is Living in the Simulacra, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Baudrillard, published by MIT Press, and it is the work of three authors, David Staton, Kathleen 𝗪𝗓𝗓𝗓, and Mark Heisten. Again, I will keep this bio brief, and the full bios are in the chat. So Davis is a 3 award-winning documentary filmmaker and associate professor at the University of Northern Colorado. Kathleen is an award-winning, 3 award-winning journalist and oral historian who has spent 20 years in interactive storytelling. Mark is an advertising and strategic communication professor who has worked with some of the largest brands in the world. Two former journalists and a former and the advertising professional, then writing together about truth and image in a post-truth age. I'm really looking forward to this. And then welcome over you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. We really appreciate it. And I just want to say Mark is unfortunately not here at the moment. He's hoping to join us. He had a medical appointment that conflicted with this. And so he's hoping to be here and will. But David and I are going to sort of take it from here. And as mentioned, our book is Living in the Simulacra, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Baudrillard. Our subtitle came from our amazing editor at MIT Press, and an acquisitions person, who is, I mean, it was great. He came up with this idea, and Noah was like, "Oh, this would be, let's do this. Let's play off of this idea," and it kind of worked for us and for the book. So this all came about because initially, Mark and I were talking. He's like, "I want to write something with you, and I want to write something about Baudrillard," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, but we've got to find the right thing to write about Baudrillard, right? We can't just like say, I'm going to apply Baudrillard's theories to anything that's out there. We've got to really look and find this very specific example," somewhat naively, because as it turns out, we ended up finding many, 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 many examples of how we're living in this world where the borders between what is real and what is not are really permeable. But it all began with looking at the first case study was this photographic essay. And when David's speaking, I'll grab the book so I can hold it up for you. But it's a book called The Book of 𝗪𝗂𝗓, which was done by a Magnum photographer named Jonas Bendixson. And it was in the town of 𝗪𝗂𝗓, which is in North Macedonia, or 𝗪𝗂𝗓, which is in North Macedonia. And truth is really sort of unstable there. There is a religion that has no historical basis to being a religion, but they claim that it is there, but there's no historical evidence of this religion actually existing. There are these things, these planks that supposedly represent the religion, which were probably fabricated by a Soviet or a Russian military commander during World War I. They were the home of fake news during the 2016 election, and were getting paid to do this information. And what Bendixson did was he kind of worked with all of these sorts of competing truth claims and sort of permeability of truth, and created a book, a photographic essay. And this is an award-winning photojournalist working for Magnum, one of the biggest photo collectives and cooperatives in the world, that was entirely fabricated. He used AI to create the images. Some of the images were based in reality, but then he manipulated them. The text was completely written by AI. The story is completely untrue. And then, to complicate things, he sends it off to a bunch of photo awards, and it wins prizes. And so then he fabricates, and he was thinking all the time, he claims, that someone would know, they would figure out that none of this was real. So he went into Facebook and bought a pre-aged Facebook profile that then outed him, but not in the way that was actually true. They outed him in a different way, and then eventually the whole story comes out. And for us, it was just, when we started looking at this, and Mark and I, and then David got brought in after we had initially written this piece about 𝗪𝗂𝗓, that it was just so perfect to talk about what is real and how do we know what is real in this world where we're working in these interactive spaces and we trust what we're seeing there. And so the book touches on everything from, issues of using artificial intelligence to fabricate things in documentaries, and should you be doing this, first off, and then secondly, excuse me, if you are doing it, how much do you need to really reveal to the audience? Interactive program shows like the avatars that have been in London for it seems like 30 years now, but I guess it's like what, 2.5. David wrote on this. It's been a couple, 2, 3, maybe 5 years that the avatars have been existing. To all of these different areas where we're increasingly interacting with the media and believing what we see. But the question is the world that we're believing actually real? And does it have anything to do with this physical space that we live in every day? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David so he can talk a little bit, and I'm going to also go grab a book.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks for having us. I think this is our second or third go round with the festival. And just real quickly to follow up on what Kathleen was talking about, avatars. That's ABBA, like the Swedish supergroup, not avatars. Avatars is the Avatar experience taking place in London that sells out every evening, and it is this very, very complex recreation using phototelemetry and all kinds of other technical aspects and CGI and AI to bring to life ABBA, the Swedish supergroup in their heyday of the 70s. And it is a dance party unlike any other, in which the performers never age, they never call in sick. They never have disagreements because they are stand-ins. And so that was one of those experiences that we had talked about as being, you know what, these are starting to crop up more and more often in our experience, and it's not so unusual anymore. I do really think part of our inquiry, and we all come from varying aspects of journalism, professional journalism backgrounds before turning to education, align really neatly with that thought of yet to be known. And in the book, which we just got our happy publication day 2 days ago or yesterday, maybe. So it's just out. I wouldn't expect anyone to be familiar with it. In the book, I talk about this thing that I used to do in my visual communication class with my undergraduate students. And what I said, one of them was this idea of the primacy of vision and how much we trust vision and what we see around us and how language kind of forms from that. And the idea was always in that class for the longest time was we see and we say. And that was sort of this firmament or this fundamental notion of truth. What we saw was true. And as we very well are aware now, that is not the case anymore. And so where do we put those trusts? Where do we find those factual basis? And that idea, again, to reiterate the title, yet to be known, might be, how do we know what's yet to be known? And the book kind of interrogates that using the framework of Baudrillard, who for quite some time, beginning in what, the late 70s or 80s, began to talk about this idea of the simulacrum, this simulation of experience, that maybe, and this has come to fruition, there was this experience of mediation that removed us, going back to those ideas of 𝗦𝗪𝗕𝗦𝗓 and the aura, the real thing. What was it? What does it mean to not experience it, but to experience a copy or a copy of a copy of a copy? And I think the book brings to light a lot of questions about where we are in relationship to epistemology and where we are in relationship to ethics, because how does ethics fit into any of these discussions when the value in thinking about ethics and harm and ethics and truth, the value of those may be completely negated in these mediated spaces or these interactive spaces, or maybe a different set of rules or laws applies. And I think we're floundering a bit right now about what do we do with that and how do we do it. I think Kathleen has the book of veils there with her. That was kind of, yeah, that was the impetus in thinking about these representations of truth and our mediated experience with them. Kind of goes back to that Platonic idea of forms and what is real. And so we do discuss those ideas of ethics, of the increasing tension. Again, I mentioned that we're all former journalists, and we kind of came at it from that perspective before turning into higher education. But this very well could have been a book that came from a political economy perspective, still examining those truths and effects on labor markets and what's real and what's not real. I know Mark, who couldn't join us or may join us later, was kind of, we were going to lean into Mark a little bit to talk a little bit more formally about Baudrillard, but he really does give that framework that we're talking about here of sort of the dissolution, the slow dissolution of the real, and the move to a space where reality, or hyper reality, as he calls it, really connects to no known truth, no known data. It has no known referent. And yet that's increasingly the spaces that we're finding ourselves in for education and for entertainment. And the book goes into several anecdotes about our experiences with that.
And just to kind of piggyback onto what was David saying before we, kind of wrap up here, there is a, one of the things that Baudrillard notes in all of this is, does it really matter? And that's where the subtitle comes from, the How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Baudrillard. Because, he's saying that when we may be wrong traditionally, and this is, again, this yet to be known thing that is so prominent at the conference, but traditionally we want to think that we know something, and we know that it exists, and we can verify that it exists, and we can touch it in the physical world and these sorts of things, and we know what its references are. And Baudrillard begins to ask, well, does that really matter if something has its existence in another space? Do we need to just sort of accept it for where it is and then interrogate it on, and interrogate on those terms rather than trying to constantly make it refer back to something that's in the physical world? And as we're in these spaces that we're currently in, it becomes even more and more and more evident that we do need to be interrogating these things on their terms and in the terms of these virtual spaces, rather than thinking about them in terms of how they relate to the real, because they're not always operating in the same way. I also want to really quickly, two of our endorsers are in this panel today, and I want to thank both of them, both Hudson and Stefano, for contributing and really,
Yes,
and
thank you.
the book before publication and everything, and really, giving that sort of endorsement for MIT, because we really appreciate it. So I just want to give a shout out there before I end.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, David, and also Matthew, for talk about your books. Listening to both books, I found that each of you is drawn to that line between preconception and avatar, and also representation of truth and the real, between what has already taken form and what is still hovering as potential. Though our approach is very different places, I found. So once a book step across that line as a form of a play, or the avatar, while the other follows the real as it comes undone as a hyper-real, hyper-truth. So I'd like to begin there. I will start with a few conceptual questions first about all of your books, and then move toward more pragmatic ones about how you wrote and published your books. So both of your books live on threshold, as I mentioned it very earlier, and each of you has a name for it. Matthew, your book calls a liminality. I'm fascinated, especially about the relationship between the liminality and 𝗪𝗓𝗓, queer desire and female subjectivity that predate a stalker. The vampire posed for me the between enemy and avatar, dead and undead. And the living in the simulacra calls in the pure simulacrum, where the image no longer refers to real world so much as to other images. Both threshold and the usual path of knowing break down. So Matthew fighting the vampire as enemy is not enough to understand it, and watching it from a distance is not enough either. In living in the simulacra, what our own eyes have seen no longer count as proof. So let me ask each of you in turn. So Matthew, I'd like to hear what playing the vampire lets us understand and watching alone does not. And I will again that make a question to Kathleen and David. Once seeing is no longer believing, I wonder what your book invites us to hold on to. So, and then that is to question for individually. Is that okay? So you can start from Matthew.
I think what the vampire allows us to see when we engage with it as a player, as an avatar, is that the vampire has a whole raft of complexities that I think are really intriguing to engage with as from their perspective. Oftentimes, when we see film and television, even when we look at sort of a vampiric society, so films such as Daybreakers, which is not like high concept vampire analysis, I understand, but when vampires become a whole bunch of people, they often gravitate towards a human perspective. And that's simply because, you only have 120 minutes, or you only have a TV series. It's more easy to see them as humans with powers. What I think engaging as a vampiric avatar does is it allows you to stretch out some of these questions that are often either rushed or perhaps not given the time that they could have. So, for example, what does an immortal society look like? How do the norms and the ethics of an immortal society change when you have every time to live? What are the rules, the do's and don'ts, and how do they change when you're literally feeding upon the rest of humanity? And is it a overt feeding, or is it a covert feeding? And if it's covert, how do you manage that? one of the really interesting things about Vampire the Masquerade is that they come up with principles. They literally come up in the law with tenets about you don't break the masquerade, which is basically you don't show yourself as a vampire. You don't feed upon your own kind because that's basically forbidden. We have humans, they're the feeding ones. You don't feed upon your own kind because there's a hierarchy here. There's power and things like that. So it's really interesting to see that you can begin to stretch out these sort of terms and approach general sort of issues about the world like power, hierarchy, race, gender from a different perspective and see them fleshed out in a way that sort of incorporates the vampire in an immortal state rather than simply just, oh, this is a vampire that's been projected where human norms and ethics have been projected onto it. So I think that's one of the really important things that allowing us to be the vampire does. The other thing that I would say is that being the vampire allows us to look at certain aspects that we often take for granted. So, for example, when you watch Bram Stoker's Dracula, we assume that Gary Oldman's a military genius, but we don't actually see him run his province of 𝗪𝗧𝗧𝗧. We don't see him actually direct troops. We see him kill people. Vampires are now in a place where they can be generals and administrators in games and allows us to think, well, how does an immortal being act towards their troops? How does an immortal being act towards as an administrator? How do they get around the things? Do they become too aloof from the peasantry, or do they become a sort of perverse feudal barony where they're literally driving, people beyond death? One of the most famous tabletop war games, Warhammer, actually creates a vampire army where other sort of undead below them, such as zombies and ghouls, sort of act as a sort of weird undead feudal pyramid. So I think that they're the sort of things that the vampiric avatar allow us to sort of think about, whereas looking at a vampire or viewing a vampire don't necessarily give us the chance to.
Thank you.
David,
Yes, Kathleen and David. Yes.
Do you want to start, David, or do you want me to start off?
I was wondering if we might, if I understand the question correctly, it was related to what can we hold on to? Is that correct? What can we hold on to
Yes.
amidst all of this? And I actually really love what Jennifer Reitman just wrote in the chat, simply because I just read 𝗪𝗖𝗓𝗓 for another conference presentation, that idea of play and creativity against this idea of rationality. I think what I stressed in that other conference, and I'm not trying to hybridize or conflate. I just think it's a really interesting comment at a really interesting time. The idea of the essentialness and the fundamental ways in which we need to and should embody homo ludens, the idea of creativity in play. I think the balance there in between these spaces where we don't know what is the truth, and as I said in this previous conference, it has to be resistance, and it has to be a resistance that is visible and viable and vital when we're talking about those spaces of creative play, and that can take a multitude and a host of forms. I particularly talk about artistic expression in those ways and voices of resistance, but that can come from not just the visual arts, but from our great poets and authors, and really reconsidering where we are in our positionality and how we've been interpolated by all of these varying factors now. Where is the hope and where is the promise in it? I hope it's in that sense of creativity and that sense of play. And I also hope, and I know it's a far, far too often overused word or concept, that we really begin to broaden our thoughts about what media literacy looks like. And we don't just give lip service to media literacy, that we really completely understand how many different aspects that involves that lead to critical thinking and the sort of consideration that we have to give to history and ethics and economic structures and power structures. I think that we can find promise and at least some glimmers of hope in there if we are that critical consumer. I hope that kind of touches on what you were asking. I'll let Kathleen fill in what I missed.
Well, and actually, when I first heard the questions, I was actually thinking, I immediately went to our, we wrote a chapter on, and it was me who mostly took the lead on this particular section, went way too deep into the world of deep fake porn. And that was initially where I went with all the dangers that could be and the potential harms that happen at that sort of space where your things are not real, but they're having really, really serious real world implications when someone's face gets hijacked into that sort of way. But then as David is talking, I started thinking then on that more on that hope side, and turn to, the very real parasocial relationships that we have with media characters. And what I was thinking of was, was Star Wars and Princess Leia, and and how people, this 40 some odd year old film franchise, which then gets rebooted and remade and, sequel after sequel after sequel and prequel and whatever. But there was a really delicate dance that they were trying to do when Carrie Fisher died in the middle of filming, because, this is a character who was supposed to be the character for the last film, that she was going to be her coming into her powers, her force. That was supposed to be initially the concept. And then she dies, and they haven't shot any of this. So they had to really do this very careful dance as to what to do in a way that wasn't going to anger fans and anger the people who had this very real relationship with her, that has this life, this with her. And I say her being the character, who take on Princess Leia as a sign of resistance, who take on Princess Leia as a sign of hope, as a sign of power, as a sign of what a powerful woman looks like. Even though this is this fictional character in this, very sort of soap opera type, space opera type world, she still had these very real resonances within the real world. And those resonances were drawn by these parasocial relationships that became even stronger in this age of the simulacra, where we're able to have these conversations online and build these communities online and really sort of reinforce all of those things in online spaces. And they didn't get the pushback that they might have gotten in other places. So they did something right in that film to honor what the fan knowledge was of that character and balance that fan community and fan knowledge with more commercial Hollywood needs. So, I mean, maybe there's some hope, maybe, there's kind of hope there, I think, when I'm looking at it in terms of how we can navigate this space.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. About the creativity and of the playing is actually for my next questions. And then I'm glad that you mentioned of creativity of playing and also relate to it, the vampire as well as Avatar. So this is connected with my personal experience. And on Blue Sky and Mastodon, I'm not sure if you ever heard of, it's a decentralized platform, social media platform where individuals run their own servers and reshape them in code. So I run my own server as well. And then recently I kind of realized that the younger generation build characters and avatars on their narrative, as you mentioned of Leia as well, and take those characters on as avatar in role play or spin new stories and narrative in VR and act as character. It's almost a simulacra of their own world making, I found, and also related with the avatar role playing of the game. And I see that it work as a culture of play, and so that users or players choose the changes and becomes it and modulating it, and images are continuously shifting. So in those activity and process, and they build an autonomy of their own along the way. And the viewer in a fluid of fabricated images feels their relation to the real growing weaker. So let me ask you both, not both, Kathleen, David, and Matthew, all of you. In the way that very awareness, Kathleen and then David mentioned, of awareness of living in the simulacra is already a theoretical and ethical practice. And Matthew, you players find in the vampire a safe space to face what hurts them. So in these two movements, how does each of you see the relationship between agency and autonomy of the viewer and the player or the users of awareness and playing? And what does each book leave in the hand of that younger generation, and one building Simulacra of their own, and the fluid cannot take away. So
I'm
maybe
happy to start. I'm happy to jump
do you,
in. I mean,
do you
or
want to
Matthew.
start?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think it's weird because I don't know, because so much is believable. I mean, what we see in these spaces feels real, and I mean, I think like there's a photographer, we've wrote about several photographers. One photographer that we wrote about is, is using, is doing things. It was a project that was called 2000, no,
90 miles.
90 miles. Thank you. Yeah, 90 miles. The distance between Florida, the tip of Florida, and Cuba, and was doing a story, a series of a series of photo essay about people who were escaping Cuba, and they look really real and they're really beautiful and they're really gorgeous. And of course, spoiler, like where I'm going with this, right? None of it's real. It's all created by AI. And the dangers that we see there is that, AI, because of its reliance on past images and its reliance on past media, it ends up, reinforcing stereotypes. So everyone who's escaping Cuba is dark skinned and they look kind of, gently impoverished, and they have, it's a huge stereotype. And that doesn't necessarily, there's the risk that that doesn't necessarily get interrogated. Or David, you had mentioned something, you were at the photo workshop where, photographers, with the search, and I'm forgetting all of the details on that, but like the top image that was found for an area. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to tether this back to the idea of autonomy and asserting oneself in those instances and developing an avatar or developing an identity in there. But it seems to me autonomy from a philosophical perspective is sort of a mutual respect that takes place. And I think that in some ways kind of gets backed out in some of these environments. And I think one of the things that you were talking, which photograph were you talking about, Kathleen?
I was there was something, I know that there was something where it was a search for a top photograph of a
Oh yeah,
location.
so I did a workshop with the International Center for Photography about 2 summers ago, and in asserting your autonomy, I think, and this is coming at it from a cynical perspective. If you were to look for the top um, the top hit, if I was doing a Google search because I wanted to investigate this particular piece of land, which is in Big Sur. I forget the beach that's exactly there. And I wanted to do some research there. And I was reaching out and I was going to construct a body of knowledge. What would happen is that in Google search engines and in other search engines, that top referenced image is AI generated. It's a CGI image. And so I think that's incredibly dangerous to be using that sort of knowledge. And the question of autonomy implies respect. And at that same conference, there wasn't the idea of autonomy. It was led by some visual artists. There was the idea that intention mattered more than consequence. And so I'm not quite sure if we're discerning enough at this point to be able to enter into these seemingly very, very real environments and believe fully that it was well intended. That was my takeaway from the artists. They kept talking about intention rather than consequence. And so the consequence is actually you're being misled, and that is harm, and that is not respecting autonomy. So I've kind of flipping the script here a little bit and thinking about those spaces. I think you have to enter them again, leaning into a bit of that idea of um, a healthy skepticism, not cynicism, which is different, but a healthy skepticism and the ability to have that level of literacy that makes you ask, am I in this space? And if I am in this space, am I being treated fairly? Is if I'm in a Second Life setting, I know that's a dated reference, but there's still research going on in Second Life. Um, am I in an environment in which I feel safe and I feel that is ethically bound um, in a binary way that reflects the ethics and the legal side that I know IRL, right, in real life? So it's a really sticky question you mentioned there, because if we are truly talking about autonomy from a philosophical perspective, and the utilitarianists, the consequentialists, going back further to Kant's imperative, that idea of autonomy assumes civil society based on that sort of mutual respect. And I don't know that deception works within that autonomy.
I think touching on both Catherine and David's points, like there has been a lot of in the vampire space, there's been a lot of interactive space. There's been a lot of well-intentioned ideas of publication, particularly in the tabletop role-playing game space, of games attempting to weave real-life history into vampiric lore and vice versa. And oftentimes it has been clumsily implemented. Where I think sometimes the autonomy comes from players is that there has been a more vociferous sort of dialogue between players and designers about what is okay and what is not okay. So, for example, one of the most prominent ones lately has been Dungeons and Dragons Ravenloft scenario, which is one thing I cover in my book, where a lot of the characters and non-playing characters you meet in the Ravenloft setting, one of them still uses an ethnic slur for the Romani, and that has still been pointed out by players again and again. And the way that they reinforced sort of Gothic sensibilities, they didn't really engage with the fact that this is not a singular person's vision of a Gothic milieu. This is a prompt that several other people will then use for their role-playing game, and that causes a whole lot of other problems, particularly when you then put that prompt alongside other tropes that you're using to create this sort of melting pot of a role-playing game. And I think that's one of the things that players are beginning to become more active in sort of saying to designers that that's okay. On another level, I think one thing that Vampire the Masquerade does really well when it comes to autonomy is that it allows players to gain autonomy when they fail. So one of the things about a lot of role-playing games is that when you roll the dice and you fail a check, you can feel very isolated because you're not hitting the monster, you're not climbing up the wall, and you're just sitting there while everyone else does something. In Vampire, because of the way that hunger works, if you eventually get to the stage where you fail and you're too hungry, your beast begins to come out, but it's not something that is out of your agency. Instead, it's a negotiated sort of dialogue between yourself and the games master about what happens. What do you do in this moment? So you still get to act out a scene where everyone around the table is like, what the hell are you doing? But because you have the ability to then fail. And I think that's really interesting, the idea of having autonomy about being a flawed character and not just being a hero, but sort of having that ability to upend the table is quite fascinating. I think that's one of the things that having autonomy in role-playing games really is something that a lot of new role-playing games are beginning to get inspiration from Vampire from.
Thank you for all of you to answer. I'm actually looking at our time, so I will both open the question from the other. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And I also have questions, another question to both all of you, if that is okay. Do you have any question from? Okay, I will start. So I found that you two books are full of qualitative evidence interview, and then the Kathleen's and David's practical examples and in-depth case studies. So for Living in Simulacra, the fabricated book of Velvet that you showed, that won the photojournalism award, Avatar newscaster delivering the news, a theater piece that deceived the senses themselves. Matthew interviews with the designers, actual play artists, and gamers from tabletop to live action role play. Both two books then gathers these lively encounters. So I found that when you encounter that lively examples and the people, and that has a stage with you and time market left, and what the book argues or in how you wrote it. So what kind of encounter you remember most, but you didn't really include it, or you decide not include it within your book?
I know for us, we're writing a book about something that's rapidly changing, right? I mean, it's this environment is just changing so fast as we're literally writing the book. And it was kind of, we kind of had to get to a point where we just said, and we do say this in the book, that we're not trying to be completely up to date. We're just trying to look at some things that potentially can start a conversation, because otherwise we would never have finished a book. I mean, literally, it would just, we would still be gathering things today, trying to get a book together because there are new insights and new things. And in fact, like, I've been, working for, I've been doing some work with some AI labs for the last few months, and I have insights that I would think about that are different than maybe how I would have thought about it when I was writing this book, which, as David joked with Mark when we had publication day, have we been working on this since 1990? Because it literally felt like it. We had been working on it for so long and putting it together for so long that, but it would just have, there are just things that you would have, it's that you would have thought about it in different ways, or raised case studies in different ways had we, based upon how we've been going through things. So at some point we just had to say, this is what we're doing, and we're kind of just going to leave it there and not worry about moving forward to some of these other issues that are percolating in our world today. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but that's at least where I'm thinking about when I heard your question.
I
Yeah.
do want to springboard to one more example, and thank you for mentioning those. It seems like you spent some time with the book. One of the case studies that we talk about, and one of the things that we haven't touched on formally in this discussion, and I do think that it remains on topic with the kind of the directive here in thinking about yet to be known, is we do find some comfort in things that we feel like we do know. And in fact, there's a picture of me as a kid in the book. I'm holding a dog, and that seems very real to me. I'm about 6 or 7 years old. I'm hugging this dog. It's a black and white photo. I have a very vivid and clear memory of my father. He had a Polaroid camera, and he would shake it. This is well over 55 years ago, and I still remember that very moment. What we're seeing, though, and what we've seen in one of the instances, is those tethers to reality moving forward, that idea of nostalgia. I look back on that time, I can smell the grass, I can see my father. Those ideas of phony nostalgia are occurring at your fingertips now, because one of the examples we use in the book is just a simple app that goes onto a very popular camera that can make objects appear closer or erase people from the scene. And this was a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade commercial for a new camera. And a young woman was dancing with the Rockettes, but she wasn't dancing with the Rockettes. She was some 15 to 20 feet or meters away from the action. But her mom used the camera to place her right next to the Rockettes. And so you can imagine, and then at the end line is something like, "Look, mommy, I'm a Rockette now," the famous dancing troupe. And mom says, "Yeah, you are." So years from now, we might imagine that same girl using that photo as a referent of reality and having nostalgic feelings about something that never happened. And I think that's another interesting element here. We've talked a lot about technology and our insertion into it, and its literal insertion into us. But that idea of false memory being crafted and created through these applications, I think, is a really concerning one, and may relate to that sense of autonomy again. If we began to have these sorts of false memories and say, yep, this is what happened. I have this photo here to document it. That document is patently untrue.
I think for me, the thing that really came across with some of the things is how much uh, they invested in sort of their vampire character being a sort of safe space for themselves to discuss and confront various trauma that occurred to them. I had at least one person who discussed with me that they had been sexually assaulted at least once during their time, and they found the idea of their using their vampire to talk about things like power and imbalances and things like that was something that really helped them. I think the other thing that I didn't include, but I thought what struck me about this was that there is a very big parasocial element to the gaming community still. And there was one or two people who I discussed who had critiqued very large actual play organizations and with very valid critiques, and they had in turn been had been doxxed and given death threats and things like that. So there is still what struck me, I guess, was the courage that they had and the privilege I had to talk to them. So I felt very, very honored and felt very, very I was very, very keen, I guess, to make sure that I got their points across. I think they got sick of me in the end, emailing me back all the changes to the draft and how I was quoting them, just so I felt like in my own mind, I was at least showing their words to the best of my ability.
But the problem, Matthew, that you mentioned, and with all of this, and I know Stefano has a question in this chat, and I know Jennifer's got her hand up as well. But I mean, the issue that with all that, when you're looking at, like I mentioned earlier, that the whole deep fake porn rabbit hole that I went down, and it's different when we kind of tried to, and I think there is a difference between something that happens to a celebrity, which is terrible and awful, but they are a public figure. But you're seeing increasingly these things happening to people who are not public figures.
Yeah.
Or the flip side of that, you're seeing people that you mentioned that people use their avatars for power and they're escaping sexual assault and using it as a way to kind of build, understand, take control of their narrative. But there are also the flip side is they're in these spaces you're seeing like there's, we wrote about an instance of a girl being raped in her avatar being raped. And so that's still, it's not really a crime, right? Because it's not really happening, but it is. It still has that same sort of emotional and there's not the physical harm that's done, but there is the same sort of emotional violation that's taking place. And it's very, it's terribly, terribly harmful because this space is bleeding over into the real world.
Yes, very much so. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about, like, particularly, it's very interesting that, like, these sort of spaces, particularly creative spaces and sort of actual play spaces, often will fall back on the thing that, oh, we're just a bunch of people creating a role-playing game, or we're just a bunch of people, just a bunch of creatives. And at some point, when you get to that $300,000 a month tier, there has to be a threshold where that changes. And I think one of the things about having a parasocial relationship with these groups and with these actual plays is that you don't necessarily see them as a company. You see them as a bunch of people that you obviously have this great relationship with. So that if someone else decides to critique them from a corporate perspective and say that this is, you can do this in your own private game, but this is no longer a private game. This is now something you're putting out on the internet, and therefore the values you're projecting are something that obviously could cause potential harm to a lot of groups. That's where I think, particularly for one of my interviewees, is where that sort of thing happened, and you're not necessarily able to sort of but you're not able to sort of claim the same sort of creative investment that you once did if you were just a bunch of people sitting around the table playing Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, which I find really fascinating and is something I may look at in the future, that sort of parasocial community.
Okay, so I see two questions. One raised a hand, and then from Stefano to Kathleen and David. So apology, I'm having issues with my headset, and thank you for presenter for brilliant books and very inspiring presentations. If the transition from we see, we say to an algorithmic we say, we see means that the real has finally vanished into the concept, is your book an act of resistance meant to reconnect us to a lost truth, or is it a final Zen moment designed to help us to stop worrying while the simulation completes its model of reality?
That's fantastic. And my response to Stefano was, we do write about the Zen moment that used to be a YouTube interstitial they would do between programmings. They would have, and now your moment of Zen, and it would be puppies playing, it would be penguins dancing, it would be the most charming 30 seconds to a minute of this just sort of nature reflective spiritual Zen moment. And then they started using AI to produce the nature documentaries, and then they started to add sponsorships. This Zen moment brought to you by Progressive Insurance or something like that. And so it became corrupted, and the simulacrum insinuated itself into this really kind of special Zen moment. And I think, you know, that's a metaphor, but we can think about that in everyday life, how those elements of commerce and those elements of reality come crashing down, and political alignments and all of those sorts of things. I don't know if what we have is an act of resistance. I do hope it's an act of provocation when people do take a look at the book and the things that we're talking about within it and go, there's something to that. Or I just experienced this thing the other day. I remember not too long ago, Kathleen and I were at a Costco, you know, the new bowling alley for communal gatherings, and we looked at a TV, and she said, that looks more real than real. And in some ways, I think that's where we are, that inability to discern what's right in front of our face because we screen so much information and we mediate so much information. That's a great question. And we have moved from we see, we say, to we see, we say, but we don't necessarily believe.
And, you know, and I think part of it too is just for me, you know, it's not necessarily, I don't know that it's maybe, you know, what we were trying really hard in the book, and I don't know if we're entirely successful at it. I would hope that we are, but it's to say that, you know, we're not trying to come down on one side or the other, and to say, you know, I don't necessarily think the simulacra, you know, being in these spaces is all bad. Just like being in the physical world isn't all bad. It's all balancing and trying to figure out where you understanding, you know, it's, you know, you don't want to have like a moral panic, like, you know, every time there's a new media, there's a moral panic, right? It's going to destroy the world. All these horrible things are going to happen. And somehow there's adaptation that takes place. And I think that that's where we are with these spaces right now. And I'm hoping that the adaptation is successful enough so that we don't turn into like the Wall-E world, but we're actually, or the Matrix, you know, where we're actually still engaging in these physical spaces, you know, and then also, and these physical things, and then also understanding how we can balance it with these virtual spaces and bringing those and trying to see them both for the pluses and minuses that each have. But that's very, very, very Pollyanna-ish, I know.
I mean, I also researched Deleuze and the delusion ideas of actuality and then virtuality. It's not fixed at all. It's always moving each other. So I agree what
Yes.
you are saying, and that there is some sort of possibility of creativity within it. And then that was the one reason I mentioned of chaos, although the chaos as a very negative term can be, but it also has that of possibility within it. So I think maybe we can have one more questions from Jennifer, and then let's have a question from Jennifer.
So I want to share a story or talk about how I have lied. So I have evidence from when I was 5 years old from a book I made in kindergarten of a story I told my parents about my 3 older brothers throwing me in the deep end of a dam we used to go swimming in. I have a drawing, right? It depicts this whole story. I know I told my parents, I accused my brothers of doing something evil because I couldn't swim in the deep end. It wasn't until I was 13 or 15 or something that I understood that I probably, at 5 years old, saw three teenage boys throw a teenage girl into the deep end, and she was screaming. And so I had, as a child, this is my story, right? Had, as a child, I think, empathized with this teenage girl who was probably having a great time having all this attention in that scenario. But I had interpreted it as very scary because I myself could not swim in the deep end. And I guess my point here is that, or my question or my concern or my interest in this conversation is that there was an appearance, just like we're living in this capitalist appearancing of what is right or what is wrong. And then there's this fraudulence, and then there's this wish for truth, and then also a wish for accountability. So I was trying to get my brothers to be accountable to the situation. My parents never gave me any sense of accountability. Like there wasn't a discussion. My brothers weren't punished, right? I don't even remember anything happening about, but I was clear that there was no accountability happening. But really, they were giving me space or time, I don't know, to process something that clearly hadn't happened because there were three of them, and I'm sure they said they hadn't done it because they wouldn't have thrown me in the deep end, right? So I just am wondering if maybe what we're experiencing is almost sort of like my 5-year-old version of what is truth, and like, and how can we think about ourselves as evolving to be better thinkers, that maybe this isn't some horrible, I mean, it's obviously horrible, we're living in a horrible moment, but like maybe we've been precious about the earnestness of our sensing of the truth, and we're being called to be more critical of it. Like I don't know, it's just
I think no, I actually completely relate to that in an episode or a chapter that I wrote once, and it was about trying to locate a photograph that, after exhaustive efforts and my parents' death and going through their materials, I knew this photograph. I wrote about it actually fairly recently, and it mattered to me, and it shaped the way that I thought. And then I was like, well, maybe that photograph does not exist and it's purely my imagination, but you cannot take that away from me. And I was just going to point towards the work that Kathleen has done extensively as an oral historian. She's often heard stories in talking to her collaborators, because it's a co-creative process, that factually don't align with truths. And maybe you could speak to that, Kathleen.
Well,
But nonetheless, it is informative, and it does offer this sort of experience that does make you question, did I think of that right? Was I fooled? Was I tricked? I think in our media saturated society that's happening like this, and we're being asked to make decisions. But Kathleen is really the pro in oral historians, and she noted there in the chat about memoir volontaire versus memoir involontaire.
yeah, and it's the idea is
Yeah.
like it's the voluntary versus involuntary memories, and so the things that you actually physically experienced versus the stories you hear, the stories you tell yourself. And and Benjamin talks about this. Jane Addams talks about this in some work that she did in Hull House in Chicago, and she talks about the stories that the women tell. She doesn't use the terms, but the same terms that Benjamin uses, but it's but she still is talking about it. And it's those stories we tell ourselves, the photograph that existed that doesn't exist, or the thing that happened with your brothers that didn't happen with your brothers. Those are sticky and they feel real, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're any less valuable. It just means that they're maybe not factually proven, but they can tell us something about other things. There's one oral historian, Alessandro Portelli, writes about a town literally a town in Italy that misremembered an event. They put it in a different time, and when people in the town were given physical evidence, it's like, no, this fire or this event happened. It was a strike and a walkout and things. And when this happened at this date, And it was like 5 years later than when they had said then the town all remembered it happening. And the entire, I mean, a town is completely unconcerned saying, well, it doesn't matter that it happened 5 years later. It really, it was really connected to this thing that happened 5 years earlier. And that's why it happened then. I mean, they don't care. So the memories have meaning. And I think it's really interesting in how those spaces, either the fictional spaces or the stories that we tell ourselves, really sometimes last more than the things that we actually physically experience.
I just want to qualify that I genuinely think I saw this happen to other people, right? I'm trying to get at this idea of me empathically relating to this incident outside of my body, and the way in which we empathically read or misread false or real media, right? I mean, and I'm just wondering if there isn't something here that, as we live through this incredible capitalist moment where the false appearance of value and the false truth of the hierarchy of the economic system, like there is an appearance that is so radically obfuscated, right? The truth, the income inequality, all of these kinds of things. I'm just wondering if maybe we're getting trained to think about the false appearance of capitalism through this other weird false appearancing of this weird AI or otherwise generated real falsenesses. If I mean, I'm making a weird jump here and I'm just thinking about it as you're talking, so I don't mean to take up more space, but
I think you're muted, Sungwoon.
Sorry.
There we go.
Thank you for the question. And then it's just because of your mention of memories, and then the fragility of the memory and the fragmentation of it. It's just remind me a lot of my personal experience as well. But because like I'm looking at our times, and we are coming to the end of our hour. Not sure if the real time passed so quickly. It's just a surprise that time is so fast. So I would like, for the end of our hour, I would like to invite all of you to put a takeaway into the chat for a tribute to the Professor 𝗦𝗘𝗕𝗦𝗧. The something you are carrying away from this session, a thought, a question, a line that stayed with you while those come in. I want to thank Matthew and Kathleen and David about talking about your wonderful books, and then talking about the truth, and then the vampire as well. And while I had a lot of questions, but like as I said, like the time in the 4 a.m. is just super fast. Actually, I had a more question of 𝗪𝗕𝗦𝗧, because Matthew, in your book about the 𝗪𝗕𝗦𝗧 was like it was for me it was very briefly passed, and then I wanted to hear more about the relationship of the liminality of it. But thank you Matthew.
Thank you, Sun, for a wonderful panel. Yeah, 𝗪𝗕𝗦𝗧 is a really fascinating vampire to talk about in terms of gaming, because it is one that often gets gazumped by Dracula, but they do have some really interesting texts, which, yeah.
There was if we have, I just want to mention one more thing, because a while after I read your book, I found a night the night battles, witchcraft and Agrarian cults in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm not sure if you. So like after I read your books, and then that night battles, I realized there are so much more things within what you mentioned of vampire. And then thank you for your book as well. And then Kathleen and David, thank you again, like about the truth and the simulacra.
Thank you so much for having us. This was great.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.